Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Oops, is this working? Oh, back. There we go. So before I get into the content, a couple logistical things. So lunch will be at 1:15, from 1:15 to 2 when we're done here. I was trying to think if there's like a guide to when it's best to make a presentation. I don't know if it's better for a bunch of hungry people or right after lunch is always back because then people are taking a nap. There's also 2 minutes left in the Minnesota Gophers NCAA tournament game. So if anyone wants to check and give me, they're up by 12. So if someone can just give me a thumbs up, we can do that too. So hopefully people aren't too distracted by brackets as well. But I'm really hoping to use this session to share a little bit of my thinking, but hopefully also start a conversation and hear questions, but also hear stories back from the sort of collective brain we have in this room and that we have at Domo Palooza. And so for those of you who don't know me or who weren't in there on the main stage, my name is Ben Shine. I'm Vice President of Data Curiosity and Innovation here at Domo. And what I want to talk about today is something I've been really traveling around the world, talking to different customers and different venues about, and it's really this idea of data for the 99%. So how do we change the way that data is used in our organizations so that it's not just about the 1% of data engineers, of data scientists, of maybe some really smart analysts who are using data, but really it's for everyone. And so a lot of that to me is this idea, and you can see it in my title, of how do we unlock data curiosity in an organization. And so before we dig into a little bit of that, just a little bit about myself and sort of my experience, which frames what I do as well. I write Evolution of a Data Dork, and it actually didn't involve a lot of formal data education. So I got an undergraduate degree in philosophy, politics, and economics, maybe a little bit of data and economics, but not a ton. And then spent 6 years at a software startup, which is an interesting experience, doing database software. So that started my training, or informal training in data, so coding, selling, cleaning bathrooms, right? I was the 6th employee, so you do everything. It's just how a small company works. And then I sort of decided I wanted to go and be a grown-up or become a businessman, and I went back and I got my MBA at the University of Minnesota. My wife was from Minnesota, and I said, forget this technology stuff, I'm just gonna become a businessman, or whatever that meant. And I ended up, out of business school, I got a job at Target, which we alluded to earlier. And so I spent about 10 years at Target, and the first 5 years were really in finance. And what I found in finance was that I was the financial analyst and then even eventually the financial manager who broke everything, right? I broke Excel, I broke SAS, I broke MicroStrategy, I broke whatever tool they would give me or give my teams. I was always pushing this envelope. And so a part of my journey into data and analytics was sort of wanting a chance to start building envelopes and building bigger envelopes. And I realized that that was how I could sustainably change target or organizations, whereas if I pushed the envelope, it would sort of expand while I was there, and then I would leave and it would go away. And so I was lucky enough to join in 2013. I joined, I was actually in finance in Target.com, so I knew they were doing this work to start a new team called, I inherited a lot of bad acronyms, so Business Intelligence Analytics and Testing, BIAT, which was the digital analytics team. And I've learned that you could brand anything is sort of what I've learned. If you do good work, people don't care what you're called. They'll use a cruddy acronym. So that was for a couple of years, focused on the digital business. That's when I first was exposed to Domo and just exposed to different ways about thinking about data and trying to change the way people were using data. And I spent 2 years there, and then in 2015, as part of a reorganization, Target formed a center of excellence called Enterprise Data, BI, and Analytics, EDABI. So another great acronym, sounds like a Middle Eastern country. And really in that role, I continued some of my digital work, evolved into broader merchandising analytics and tools, and that's part of sort of this journey that brought Domo into Target and other pieces. And so, while I was at Target, as much, and I have a bunch of former Target colleagues in the audience, they could call me out if I misspeak on anything, but I loved what we did at Target. I loved a lot of how we were changing the culture, but I also knew that it was about more than just software, right? As much as I just came and worked for a software platform company, that there was this data curiosity. There was a new way of engaging with data that was happening, and that had partly to do with a tool, and a good tool like Domo, but it also had to do with culture and how we approach data and how we encourage people and how we unlock things, and that's a lot of what I'll unpack here. But what I realized is that was never the core. I had some time to think about that at Target, but I had 20 other things on my list. Right, I had to get the things done and help run Target and help run data and analytics at Target. And so part of my evolution to Domo was wanting to have a chance to explore some of these ideas of data curiosity. What does that mean? How does it work? Can I go around the world talking about this, which I've been able to do? Can we work with customers across different industries, different size companies, different countries, different cultures within the companies, and test some of these things, understand it, and then lastly, bring that back into the Domo product. So a lot of the various features, it's like I still believe that you can build a product that helps unlock these things. And so in June 2018, I made that big switch. So this is my first Domo Palooza on the Domo side. And I've sort of been exploring this. And so what I want to do is I want to unpack some of the thinking of what I saw at Target, but also what I've been seeing as we've been meeting with more and more organizations across the country and across the world. So at the core of what I believe we do, or most of the people in this room do, I think there's a core dilemma that we all feel, even if we don't always name it. And at the core, it's this. It seems hard, too hard, very hard, frustrating to get the data and insight you need to solve a business problem, right? I think that probably encapsulates most of the things we've been seeing on the main stage, a lot of the breakouts. And this isn't necessarily a logical feeling, right? This is an emotional feeling. It feels too hard if you're on the analyst side, you're on the data team side, if you're part of that 1%. It feels too hard if you're part of the 99% that doesn't have access to it. And so one of the things, as we think about approaching an organization, changing how we use data, is that we have to remember that data is emotional. Right? It doesn't feel that way. It feels like, oh, it's data. It should be black and white. It should be a formula. It should be, I'm a data person, math and right and wrong and all these things. But the reality that most businesses or nonprofits or whoever it is have lived is that data has been emotional, right? So there's been broken promises. There's been wasted investment. There's been things that have just been, you've been disappointing your partners, right? I think this is a two-week street. The unlocking for the 99% is also about how do we make our 1% feel more energized and passionate about what they're doing. And if you're delivering something that's not meeting the need, you don't feel good about yourself either. I think there's a lot of interesting, but not useful, right? A lot of times we're like, oh, that seems cool. But if it's not actually useful, then what's the point? And we've just spent this money and this resource. And again, it comes back to that core problem. I just not having what I need. And why does it feel so hard for me to get that? And how did we get here that there's almost, I talk sometimes about, it's almost like we're data therapists, right? Like you are bringing someone through therapy to get rid of this emotional baggage, to bring them on this journey, to empathize with where they've been, to help them understand that it doesn't have to be that way. And so it's not just about a, did you meet this requirement? It's not just about a yes or no. It's about how do I start helping people get on this emotional journey. And so when I think about this emotion, one of the experiences that crystallizes in my mind, and I'm a big believer that when things stick in your mind, there's a reason, right? And so this is back in 2016, which now is 3 years ago. And I got an email. And the email was from a buyer at Target who was in charge of the big storage and organization bins at Target. So you can see the pictures, right? The stuff in there. And she emailed, and she wanted to tell me about her own Black Friday. And I'll share the slides so you don't have to take a picture or try to read it, and I'll get to the points. But what the email basically said was, hey, we just had all this amazing reporting for Black Friday at Target. And I gave a presentation a couple years ago about it at Domo Palooza. And right, we had live data and item level detail and store level detail and almost real-time data and all these things. And her ask was, you know what? She had a different Black Friday. Her Black Friday wasn't Black Friday and Thanksgiving and Cyber Monday. Her Black Friday was a week after Christmas, right? Because that's what everyone buys storage bins to put all their presents away and put all the wrapping paper away. And they had, the front of the circular and all these different pieces. And so she got up the nerve, I guess, to email me and ask about it. And I saw all this emotion in that email, right? And I recreated the email from memory because I remember reading it and just thinking, God, there is so much emotional baggage here, right? And so what was she feeling? So part of it was sort of this feeling that her work is not important enough, right? It's like, I know this isn't as big as Black Friday. I know that it doesn't seem that like a big deal to you, but it's important to me. It's my Black Friday. There was a willingness to settle for less or subpar analytics and data, right? It was like, if I could just get half of what you were able to do for Black Friday, I'd be happy. I understand if it's hard, just give me one of the cards, not all 8 of them or whatever it was. There was a need to develop a complex business case and evaluation. And I'm torn on this one. Like, again, I'm a data guy. I like data. I like that people are thinking about numbers. And there's a whole big practice now at Domo as we're helping customers figure out the value of an investment in Domo or in other pieces. And that is really important. But the bottom line is, like, it shouldn't always have to be that way. Right? She shouldn't feel like she has to say, we have $200 million in sales and this much and this much. And it's not that I didn't appreciate that she was thinking about it, and I certainly want people to think about the impact of their work. But if you feel like you always have to do that, how many other people then aren't even going to send the email because they feel like I don't have enough value? There's a lot of sense of advocacy, right? Do you need my VP to email someone? Do you need them to do this, right? Again, this sense of like, it won't happen, it won't get through if I'm not able to get the business case and then the senior level leadership. And then just this sense of like, almost just, I'm just so glad you're listening, or thank you for considering it. Again, it's this sense of like, is her work not as important? And I read that email and I'm like, there is so much emotional baggage. There is just years of failed projects and being told no and all these other things that are coming out. And this is the gutsy buyer. This is the one who actually emailed me, right? How many other people just have all this baggage and just are, sucking it up and figuring it out or just not even emailing? And so as I thought about, well, how did we get here? How did we create an ecosystem? And again, people from Target can probably speak to their own experiences like this too, where there was so much emotional friction between getting the data you need and that core dilemma and asking for it or what it meant. And so then I rolled back in my mind a little bit earlier. So 3 years before that, when I just was in the digital team that I talked about, Biat, I had to go, and for a number of reasons, it was way above my pay grade, but I was pulled in to go and ask to the Capital Investment Committee at Target, which included the CEO and the CIO and the chief merchant, all these, the CFO, all these big leaders. I had to go and be the business representative or the data representative around getting $2 million for a digital promotional data project. And I remember standing there, so being a little nervous, right? It's the CEO of a Fortune 50 company, and but also just almost feeling dirty myself. Because I knew, again, back to like, it didn't seem like it should take this much money. I didn't have any other way to do it. This was what I was told it was going to cost. But also I knew that probably we'd spend all this money and it would be late and it probably wouldn't be the right data, and then I'd have to disappoint my partner again, and then we wouldn't have it, and all of that for $2 million. And so I started thinking like, well, no wonder, right? No wonder we're in these situations, because if I need $2 million for a very specific scoped problem, no wonder someone thinks, oh, I need business case and I need executive support and all these things. And so how did we get from that scenario in 2013 to the place when in 2016, when that fictional Amy asked me, I was able to say, no, you know what, the way we built this in Domo, we can actually go in and we have the cards, we can tweak it with you, we can spend an hour with you figuring out what's unique about storage and organization, and it's not about getting less than everyone else, it's not about getting only some of the cards, it's actually better than some of the cards because we can help personalize it to what you need and be flexible with you. And so, and that's just a very stark change, right? Because I bet you in 2013, if I actually took that business case, if I didn't have a flexible tool, maybe that would have been $500,000 and I would have needed this whole business case, and I would have said, oh yeah, we're working on that for next year, not for this Christmas, right? Not for 2 weeks from now. And so my hypotheses and a lot of what I've based some of my work here at Domo around and what I'm going to walk through is that the shift is an approach in how we build data platforms and how we empower people with data. And the way I think about the shift is that in 2013, we had this end-to-end mentality in terms of how we were making investments in data, in analytics, in our systems. And in 2016, what we got to was this idea of end to almost end. And I came up with this idea. We did a Harvard Business School case study around some of our data transformation at Target, and I was sitting there in a conference room at Target talking with this Harvard Business School professor and talking about some of these things and what I thought changed. And I said, you know what it is? It's like we're not building end to end anymore, we're building end to almost end. We're getting almost to what we need, but maintaining that flexibility at the very end so that I can respond to the Amy's of the world and help her on that emotional journey and show her that I can get her the data she needs for business. And so let's unpack this a little bit, and I'll define it a little bit more, and we can understand it more together. So if I think about end to end, if I think about that 2013, at the core, it really was about prioritization, right? Which isn't a bad thing. Prioritization is great. So if I have 10 problems and I don't have enough resources to go after 10 problems, at least the way I'm framing those problems, I have to pick one, right? And I might use data to pick which one. I might use valuation. I might do all these other pieces. And then I'm going to take the one problem, and I'm going to wait a long time. It's a technical term, right? With engineers. And I worry sometimes I talk about this. I love engineers. I never have enough engineers, though, right? So part of the constraint here of picking one is if I don't have an engineers to do all 10, and I need engineers to solve the problem, I'm creating a bad situation for myself. And so after a long time, 3 months, 6 months, a year, hopefully it's done, right? It goes back to this sense of just, I was in a place in 2013 where I felt like nothing ever really got finished. It got finished incorrectly. We had to change it all the time. So hopefully it's solved. Maybe not. Part of the problem is if it's not solved and my engineers moved on to something else, then I'm in trouble, right? The other problem is, right, I still have these other problems. Some of them 6 months later, a year later, went away. Hopefully the one that I picked isn't the one that no longer is relevant, right? Because I just spent all this money and this time not solving these other ones. And then of course in the interim, right, the one thing we know is business is changing. Certainly in retail, it is constantly always changing. Oh, Gophers won. We can sing the alma mater later if anyone wants to. Right, and so we have all these new problems that have come up, right? Business changes, retail changes, and so all of a sudden now we've orphaned all these problems, right? These are problems with value and other pieces that haven't gotten addressed. And so this is very much, I think, the IT ecosystem, this end-to-end ecosystem that we create, which comes from a good place, right? But it created this situation where Amy had all those emotions and where we all have all those emotions and we have that core feeling that it just seems too hard to get what we need to solve a business problem. And so again, we could say, why should we care? And probably many executives, many different project managers, et cetera, would say, you know what? Yeah, I get it, but the reality is resources are scarce. You need to prioritize. You need to figure out what's most important, and we did that, so we should be happy with that, and that's what it is. But I think it's actually dangerous to take that approach, and I think over time it can do a lot of harm to your organization. So I think one of the core things, and again, like I took on this moniker of data curiosity when I joined Domo, and how I think about it, is this idea of wanting to just create a culture of curiosity. Right, and so Claude Shannon is a famous scientist at Bell Labs. He wrote, 6 years ago, he wrote a thesis around how communications would work well ahead when they had just invented the transistor and no one really knew what it would all mean, and he predicted a lot of what actually happened. But he also spent a lot of time doing things like building chess playing devices, pogo sticks around Bell Labs, all this other stuff. And so But this quote is really powerful to me because he talks about, yes, we did all these things, but that there are valuable consequences that often proliferate from simple curiosity, right? Valuable consequences from simple curiosity. And what I think in that end-to-end scenario is that we're crushing that curiosity, right? And we're losing those valuable consequences that come from us trying to understand that and from us having people do that. And so it's not what we think we know, it's other things. And not that we should spend all of our time building chess playing machines instead of doing the work around data, but there's some balance between not always choosing and not always focusing on just one thing. And so that's my first point really is, if we just work on that one thing, if we get into that end-to-end way of thinking, then we're not going to create this culture data curiosity we wanted. And we'll expand a little bit on what that means and why that's important. There is lost business value in those orphan business problems as well. It might be smaller, but there's still value, and so we're leaving that on the table. A lot of times when I'm talking to people about this prioritization exercise, I think part of the problem is like when I say I want to have a culture of data curiosity, or I want digital transformation, or I want to change the way people use data, I think inherently we often have an asterisk on it that's unspoken. And that asterisk is often if you're working on priority 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. If you're working on priority 22, sorry, you can't, data's not important for you. Digital transformation is not important for you because I don't have the resources to do that. And so even if we didn't care about curiosity, which I do care about, and we'll get to more of that, we still have actual value there. So if there's a way for us to get at that value, that's good for the company, good for the shareholders, all those pieces. I think the other thing that plays into this is what I call the fallacy of self-service, right? And so if we think about things end to end, if we think about a set of requirements that I'm going to meet and I'm going to be done, we assume that it's just about checking off these things and handing it over to someone. And the reality is that people don't just use data. People aren't just going to start using self-service or do self-service just because you gave them a tool that met a set of 10 requirements, right? They need to give feedback on it. You need to help them. Right? Like I would tell my team that there's a fine line between self-service analytics and telling someone to take a long walk off a short pier, right? It's not like, and sometimes my team would get offended by it. It's like, oh, it's so frustrating. Like, I get it, it can be frustrating. We as a team can, in the 1%, we can all, argue about it and be frustrated together, but the reality is that it takes work. And if you think that everything's just one project, I pick one thing and it's done, and I think that's a lot of the cycles I would see, and where it led to the Amy's, it's like, well, I don't know why Amy's frustrated. We met exactly the 10 fields we had to put into the data report, and she just doesn't know how to use them, right? I mean, it was that kind of mentality. And then lastly, and some of this goes to overall agility and back to the reality of the business world, is nothing is ever complete. Certainly in the business world, right? If we all thought that we knew exactly how things are going to work for Domo, for Target, for any other company here in 6 months and a year, then maybe we could take an end-to-end approach and we would just pick the most important thing, and yeah, maybe we won't be a curious culture, but we'll be okay. But the reality is we know it'll change. And probably not in 6 months, it's probably going to change in a week, and in 2 weeks, and in 4 weeks. And if we can't respond to that, then we're in a really difficult spot as a business and as a 1%, trying to help the 99%. So coming back a little bit to the curiosity topic, in addition to sort of those consequences that Claude Shannon talked about, there is scientific evidence, and I ran into someone, I don't know if she's here, from Telium, whose mom wrote a book about curiosity, and there is scientific evidence that curiosity is good for a company. It is good for an organization. And so the September-October 2018 issue of HBR, the cover was the business case for curiosity, right? And what the research shows is that there are valuable benefits to curiosity for your organization. That you end up with fewer decision-making errors, that you have more innovation happening in your organization, positive changes for creative jobs and non-creative jobs, that you reduce group conflict, right? You're better at working together because you have more curiosity. You're more intellectually humble with how you approach different parts of the organization because you are curious if you're right or wrong. and you have more open communication, better performance overall. And so again, throw out whether you think you picked the right priority, throw out all these other things. If we're not creating a culture of data curiosity and a general culture of curiosity, we're not becoming the best organizations we can be, right? And so that would always scare me a little bit at Target too, right? And so if I can't get someone to ask a question about data, maybe it's not good for my job. But if they're not becoming curious, willing to engage, willing to ask questions, how are we going to respond to Amazon or to a new grocer or whatever all these other challenges that Target faces as a business? And so I think that data can be at the forefront of creating this curiosity that has broader benefits. And if we're not thinking about that, then we just sort of leave those on the table. The other thing to think about relative to all this, and Domo plays a piece in this also, is how do we handle those small problems, right? And I think it's a challenge because again, those things we orphaned, they're not the most important, right? No one is debating. I mean, we could have a whole debate about whether your prioritization was wrong and you didn't pick the right problem, but even if I just de facto say, yes, we picked the right problem, those other things are smaller. And one of the analogies I like to use at Target was this idea of a medical analogy. And so if I have a cold, and I went down to Rochester, Minnesota, near my hometown of Minneapolis, and I went to the Mayo Clinic, what are they going to say? If I show up and I say I have a cold, they're going to tell me, you know what, we're working on really important things, right? We're curing cancer. We're solving all these other problems, and we're using really expensive equipment, and we're really specialized, right? So why would we help you with the cold? And that's not wrong, right? Like I think this was some of the debate sometimes what happened with data scientists or engineers, right? It's like, well, I don't have time for that little thing. I don't like to add a column. I don't care about your small thing because I have a PhD or because I want to work on the cool problems. And that's not illegitimate, but the problem is that I still have a cold. I still have my data cold. So how do I solve my data cold if I've gone to the Mayo Clinic and there's no place else for me to go? The reality is, in Minnesota and many other places, right, is I do have other places to go, right? I can go to the urgent care clinic, right? And an urgent care clinic is a different kind of place. It has people who are more generalists, people who are specialized in treating multiple basic things, people who know how to juggle. It's the skill of juggling, the skill of triage. And right, and if you think about other industries like the Apple Genius Bar or other pieces, like that's the core sort of emotion it's trying to get at. And so we need systems that are flexible because we need to be able to set up the urgent cares for data, right? Because people have these small problems, because I don't have unlimited engineers, I need to be able to think about that and to do that, and that's something that we set up at Target, and the Target people here can tell you how well it's going. It's the benefit of having left someplace. I can just say how it was, and I don't deal with it anymore for the most part. Chad deals with it. Other people out there deal with it. The last thing around value and around thinking about this prioritization exercise that helps me frame it and helps frame some of my thinking, and gets a little bit back to the self-service as well, is what David Hussman, who was an agile coach and mentor of mine, he called Dude's Law. So David looked like the dude from the Big Lebowski, very much so, like long hair, used to be in a rock band, became a programmer and an agile coach. And so David's law was that value is equal to the why divided by the how, right? Value is equal to why divided by how. And so what does that mean? That means that the total value I can create is the product of how much, the why, the value, and then also how much I have to put into it. And I think in that end-to-end diagram I showed, we get really focused on the why. What's the most important problem? What has the biggest value to the organization? What has the biggest return or cost savings or whatever it is? And that's great, right? That does help drive it up. But I can also greatly increase my value by driving down my how, right? Even if the why is small, if my how becomes smaller and smaller, I'm actually adding up all those little bits of value to be bigger, right? And so if we can do more self-service, easier platform, flexible platforms, then we can still get to those small whys and drive lots of value because the how has gotten so small. And then the total value increases, right? And again, it's not saying that the other whys aren't also important. Like at Target, we wouldn't say that supply chain and new brands and all these other things that Target in the news talks about being priorities, those do get resources first. It's just everything down this line, like what Dean works on, like getting off of DB2, which he gave a presentation on yesterday. No one was going to go and build a data analytics platform for Dean based upon the value of his why, as important as it is for Target to get off DB2. But Dean had a small how. He had a Domo. He had a platform that made the how small enough that his smaller why still generated the value for Target. The other dynamic, and I talked about it before, is this idea of, again, I get worried, like, oh, Ben's up here saying engineers suck. We don't want any engineers. I love engineers. You've seen a lot of the incredible engineers I get to work at now at Domo. But we need to balance the engineer and the business. So this is a quote from Walter Isaacson's Innovators. It talks about that when you could spark innovation with engineering talent, but if you want to set the world on fire, you need the business skills to combine with it. And Walter Isaacson wrote this actually talking about Atari or pre-Atari, right? So when they were developing Atari out in California, actually, again, the version before Atari, there were two companies that were doing similar things. And one, both really good engineers, one stayed really pure to the engineering. They wanted it to be exactly the best software, all these other things. And at this point, it was talking about sort of installing them like at pinball locations and stuff like that, right? It was about a video game in a location. And they did all the best stuff, but it was costing like $30,000 or something insane to make. And so they never were going to make money. They didn't have that business context. Whereas the founders who eventually went on to do Atari, when they were testing their version, they made engineering sacrifices, knowing with the business context that we needed to balance that cost and to know what business would actually look like. And obviously Atari set the world on fire. My 11-year-old played with the Xbox, is probably still feeling some of that fire even if he doesn't know about it. But so the challenge then becomes, how do we combine that engineering talent with that business context, right? And there's not one way to do this, right? There's lots of options before us. And so one thing is, can I hire engineers that also have business skills and context? It's pretty, needle in a haystack, hard to necessarily find exactly that talent that you want and need, right? Another one, and this goes back to my thing, is I don't have enough engineers. I'm just gonna hire enough engineers so that each business area with context has their own engineer, right? So it's that the business context and the engineering talent is right next to each other, and they'll just light the world on fire and get all this value. I can try to upskill my business people with more technical skills, like Matt and his macros in Excel that I talked about before. But again, with all these, you're only going to do so much. I don't have enough money for all my engineers. I'm not going to find all the perfect engineers that know business. All my business users aren't really going to become so technical, right? And so the option is this different way of thinking. It's end to almost end. It's saying, how do I develop a different kind of platform, a different kind of tool that lets me sort of blend some of this together? A little bit of making my business more technical, a little bit of bringing more engineering to the business, and sort of bringing those together. And that's what we're trying to do. So I spent a lot of time saying what didn't work, right? I'm like, why is this end-to-end not good? So now I'm just, I'm an agile enthusiast or whatever you want to say. But how do we solve it? And so there's a few things I've seen over time as responses to this, right? And if we think about, we keep it in this end-to-end framework, one is what I would call end-to-engineer, right? And so this is the idea of common programming languages, platforms, containers like Kubernetes, trying to create more commonality that lets us scale and copy things, right? And so like maybe it lets me copy that end-to-end diagram 5 times instead of just 1 time, which is great. But again, my struggle is this is sort of it's making my engineers more powerful, but I still need an engineering skill set, right? I still need to know how to code, know how to open up things, know how to use the coding language to make it happen, so I still have that sort of resource constraint. The other extreme, which I think everyone can empathize with, is really end only. Forget about the beginning of the end, right? The first end, I'm just gonna do it. I'm gonna use Excel, I'm gonna use Access, I'm just gonna knock it out. And that's gonna feel pretty good because I don't have to wait for anything. I have ultimate freedom and control. But I think everyone in this room knows that there's a lot of dire consequences to that. I lack scale, I lack collaboration, I lack certification, inconsistency, bad data, all these things. And so, again, so what we're trying to do is get between these somewhere. And that's where this idea of end to almost end comes to, right? It's like, how do I think about, again, it's not end to engineer, it's not a coding language or a platform that's just coding based, but it's also not the finished product. It's not, I'm only solving this one problem and I'm done, and good luck if you need to change it, right? And so another analogy that comes to mind on this, and I know Derek from BBVA sort of, he had his cool water and he had much more PR support, I think, to do fancy slides with water and everything flowing everywhere. But so we all know this famous quote from Clive Humby, who was at Tesco, about data's the new oil. And his focus when he made this analogy was really around refining it, right? But when I think about that, I think it still falls down, right? Because if you think about refining oil, how many people, just have a bucket of refined oil in their garage, right? It's like, we need a gas pump, right? But the gas pump, again, like it is not this end-to engineer, this sort of raw thing. And so what are we asking people to do when they come to a gas pump? We're not asking them to put it together themselves. Like, hey, if you know the coding language, or if you know how to put together a gas pump, here's all the parts, have fun, right? We're not asking, I still laugh, my mother-in-law and my wife, they still like to have, she likes to have her husband go fill up her tank still, so I think of her when I think of her trying to put together a gas pump. I love her. We're not asking them to like, oh, well, here's this pump, but you know what, if you want to check the octane, here's all the tools, you can do it yourself, right? You put it in, you test it, do whatever. We're not asking them to do that. We're not asking people to say, hey, this is this version of the gas pump at this gas station, here's an entirely different version at another one, and you have the skills to figure it out, so just go figure it out. And I think these are the kinds of things we're sometimes, with the more technical end to engineer stuff, we're sometimes doing. We're asking people to do these pieces. And it's not that I don't want my gas customers to be more technical or my data and my business users to be more technical, but there's a balance, right? It's not just refining the oil. It's not just giving them tools that if they knew how to use them, they can put them together. Right? It's like, I want the gas pump that's end to almost end. Like, there's still some variability, right? I need to enter in what level of gas I want. I need to pay for it. I need to interact with it. But I'm not asking you to be the full refining of the oil and learning how to do that. Or maybe I'll have to work at a water analogy now that BBVA says water is a better analogy as well. And so what else? What are some of the other characteristics here of this idea of end to almost end? So again, it's this idea of like, I'm not shooting for one solution. I'm shooting for the ability to enable and empower and solve lots of little problems, right? And so really and McKinsey writes a lot about this as well, it's like the power is when I can have that last mile of insight and data delivery, sit as close as possible to where the actual business problem is and where I could solve it, where I have that context, where I could spark that fire of innovation when I combine good engineering with business context. And sometimes that might be a dedicated BI team. Sometimes that might be a really smart business person, right? And I want to be able to support both of those situations. One thing I always like to call out though is, right, it's a really fine line. And this goes back to like the legitimacy of some of what the end-to-end was trying to do, because the business problem is always the inspiration, right? I don't want a bunch of technical resources that are entirely disconnected from what they're really trying to solve. And also that can become a little bit like isolating, right? So an engineer or an analyst is like, so you don't want me to talk to the business anymore? They do it all on their own, and I just go sit in a back closet in the basement or whatever and crank away. And so it's important to know that balance, to understand that it's not just about ignoring those business problems. Use the inspiration and then enable lots and lots of smaller problems to be solved. I think the other flip side is also, this is not about, again, we're not talking badly about engineers. Like, I love engineers, and there is a discipline to engineering and to engineering rigor that is important and cannot be lost, right? So it's how do I bring that engineering rigor out to the business as part of my end-to-almost-end approach? How do I think about automation, dependency, logging, backups, usage tracking, all these disciplines of engineering that are really good and necessary, certainly in a large enterprise, certainly if we're dealing with secure data, all these other pieces, but find ways to balance that and not just have it to be like an either-or kind of conversation. So what does this look like for data and analytics? And some of this comes back to Domo and some of Josh's talk yesterday for me, right? Of that we have lots of things we have to do with data, right? And these are largely aligned to the Seven Samurai and the fancy animated version of the platform, right? And so a lot of times what I see and what I think we do is we try to solve these problems individually, right? We have these mini end-to-end silos of like, I need to solve connecting to data. I need to solve storing and indexing data. I need to solve visualizing the data. I need to solve alerting on the data. And again, that's not impossible. You have to do it, but what you inherently are doing then, you are creating these engineering dependencies between all these pieces. And you could argue, yeah, that's still possible, but again, if you really want to be end to almost end, if you really want to create this ecosystem where the Amy's of the world can be helped quickly and we're solving this core dilemma together, we can't have all those dependencies. We can't have all those roadblocks. We can't say, oh, well, we answered your question, but we hit a roadblock because we need to bring in data. That's another team. I need an engineer now. And to me, when I'm out talking about the Domo platform, working with customers, working with prospects, to me, that's sort of the key, right? It's not about like, I need one platform to do all these things. I need to minimize dependencies because if I want to ultimately change my culture, if I ultimately want to unlock data curiosity, getting these things in one place is part of how I do that. And if I create a system where I have all these dependencies constantly, then I'm not going to see that culture change. So if I just wanted to do one of these things as a company or working with one of you as a partner, fine, we could probably do it. We could check off the boxes. That's not my goal. My goal is to how do we transform the way data is used in an organization. And if we're going to do that, we need a platform, we need tools that can help go across all of these, right? And so it's not about necessarily, whether, and how it comes to life in different organizations is different in terms of what you use. But again, it's not just the sake of saying I want one tool. It's the cultural change that we know can happen if we have an end-to-end approach, end-to-almost end approach, and if we're more flexible in what we're doing. So if I rewind a little bit and think about some of the key takeaways. So one is, don't forget about those small problems, right? And this is something I was passionate about at Target and I continue to be passionate about now. Because I know it's tempting, right? And I know it's easy to just chop it off and say, again, this is the most important thing. And it probably is, this is more important than that. But if we can harvest the value of those small business problems and build a culture of data curiosity, I'm really confident that it's worth the work and the investment for your organizations, and the net will be a higher value, even if you only were working on one or two problems. Again, I think thinking about this, and Domo is a big piece of this, but it's not just this. This is a mentality as well in terms of how you're thinking about work and projects and teaching and training within your organizations. How do I build these end-to-almost end platforms? How do I allow not engineers, business people, analysts, executives to go on that journey and have that last mile of insight delivery to themselves, not because they don't value me, not because I don't want to be there to help them or that I'm not going to support them and train them and have the urgent care clinics, but because I know I can get at so much more value if I let these things happen out in the business. And the last one I'll just reinforce that I said before is, you still have to maintain engineering rigor, right? This is why I'm such a huge proponent and continue to work to evolve Domo stats, right? You need to be able to measure what you're doing. You need the discipline of testing, of data, of dependencies, usage tracking, right? We showed the feature yesterday of being able to see right away where the dependency broke down. Like, those are all engineering discipline that we cannot, and rigor, that we cannot leave on the table, right? I don't want people to walk out of here again saying, like, I don't need engineers, or as long as I just let everyone do everything and it'll be fine, right? You need to have that balance, and so finding that balance, finding a way to figure out this tension between innovation and alignment and all these other pieces is, I believe, a key part to really creating a data-curious organization and figuring out what you want. And so with that, that is the end of my formal content. We have 10, 15 minutes for questions if everyone's not running to get to be first in line. And I'm open to questions, but also if you want to poke holes or share experiences, that's part of my journey too, is to learn from all of you. So,
question back here, Ben.
So thinking about sort of end-to-end versus end-to-almost-end, with an end-to-end approach, you can kind of reduce complexity for the end user, right? Because you're presenting them with things packaged the way that they would expect them. Whereas end-to-almost-end, they end up with a lot more complexity. And I know personally we have some problems where they get overwhelmed with either the tool or the data. And can you just talk about that balance and how you think about it?
No, I think that's a really good question. And I guess I would say end to almost end doesn't necessarily have to be what the end user sees, depending on your business and what you know, right? So I think one of the times when I had a big aha around some of this thinking also came out of, like, when I started in BI at Target, it was a very sort of defined lineage of how it worked. Like, I was in business insights, so I collected the requirements and I helped prioritize it, and then I handed it to a reporting analyst who only did reporting, and if they needed data, it went to the data person. And what Paritosh, who's the chief data officer at Target, sort of helped me realize early on in Target.com was there's that dichotomy. It's not self-service analytics isn't about just dumping it off, right? So the flexibility was really saying, hey, as a BI analyst or as a BI partner, or whatever role you have, or translator role or a storyteller role, that the key is having flexibility close to the business. It doesn't mean it always has to live all the way with that business user, given what's there, right? So one of the things that we did at Target, and again, because there's all this emotion, because people have been told over and over again, they're not going to believe you if you just say, hey, this is better, this is flexible, ask questions. They're just going to be like, sure, I've heard that for the last 10 investments we made in BI and nothing ever changed. And so one of the things we did at Target when we were launching a new buyer dashboard, which I use as a potential dynamic sometimes, is we had done all this work in a flexible tool, right? Not necessarily expecting that every buyer was going to be like Matt and open up the cards and do his own thing. And we brought 10 buyers into a room as sort of test in at 8 a.m., gave them an hour, didn't tell them much, just had people sort of next to them taking down notes. After an hour and a half, called the group together. We said, okay, here are the 25 things we heard from you, sent them away, brought them back at 4 o'clock that same day with some of their executives and said, okay, well, here's the 11 of the 25 we already changed. Can we walk you through? And I could have sent 20 emails. I could have gone to 10 team meetings and had chats and open labs and all these other things, and they needed to feel that difference, right? And so it wasn't about them feeling like they were the ones having to do it, there wasn't some guidance, but it's starting that conversation so that then I can leverage the flexibility, right? And that's some of the cultural change that has to happen. Like, I worry if you're not ready to make that cultural shift, like the flexibility of Domo or of an end-to-almost end approach is only going to go so far because you're just back in the same dynamic, right? And we had cases of that too, where it would frustrate me, like someone would go and not say anything, complain up the chain, and would go up and then come back over, and I'm like, we could have gotten 90% of that done in an hour-long conversation, but people aren't used to that being the kind of scenario. So, but I think in the end, like, you have to know your business, you have to know what they're capable of, and it doesn't necessarily always mean making them do it all on their own, but being able to unlock that flexibility at some place closer to the business than in that end-to-end when it would have had to go through all these steps and these investment reviews and everything to get there. So really good question, thank you. Lunch. No other questions. Look at that. Okay, well, I'll be around for a little bit if people want to chat. Oh,
one more.
One more. Everyone was like, at lunch.
How do you speak to you're working with an IT organization who maybe struggles to see the value of, or maybe has anxiety about unlocking that data? How do you speak to that?
I do have a baseball bat, a Target baseball bat in my office, which I still have, but no. No, I think it's valid. I think, I've done some work and some writing around this idea of how do you bridge the gap between IT, data teams, which might be part of IT, might be independent, and the business. And so the three things I usually tell people is you really need to learn how to practice empathy, intellectual humility, and transparency, right? And so, I think with some of those IT organizations, like, I try to really be truly empathetic, right? How do I understand how they're incented, how they're being judged, what they've gone through in the past, the legitimacy of their concerns, right? So like, I think I was successful working with some of my engineering peers at Target because I didn't just come in saying, oh, you stupid engineers, you know what you're, I said, you know what, that's a valid concern. Let's be transparent about it. Let's measure that together. Maybe you're right. Maybe if I let more people use the data, it's going to crash the database, or we're going to have, an increase in our AWS bill, or whatever it is. But acknowledging that need and being empathetic, and then working together to be transparent about it, and being intellectually humble about what you don't know, I think helps bring them along. And end of the day, it's like I said before, like, no engineer wants to spend their day adding columns and indexes based upon business need. I mean, because even though there's value there, that's not exciting engineering work, right? So how do I find a way that honors the concerns they do have, but then empowers them to go work on more interesting, more complex, more important things than the small things they had to do before to sort of tune the system. And so I think it's starting with that empathy and just moving from there is a big piece of it. It's not a solution per se, right? It still takes time and conversation, but acknowledging that. And I think understanding some of those motivations is really important, right? Like, do you know how they're like, do they get a bonus, or is their review score based upon uptime? Right? That's an important thing for me to understand, why they might be so obsessed with uptime at the expense of me saying, but there's all this business value and I want a data curious organization. Well, you know what, if they're still incented on uptime and this is going to ruin uptime, it's just human nature that they're going to react that way. So how do we unpack some of that together? That might require some changes, or it might require talking about adjusting that goal or whatever it is. Good question.
So you referenced a couple times the idea that if achieving multiple small wins can drive value in itself. Yeah. So, but you also referenced getting resistance when you try to give that perspective. So, do you have any strategies you've employed for like conveying the value that type of approach, like maybe bottoms up, bringing some foundational things that will improve a lot of different small aspects? Because it's hard to focus on those when you have huge, big problems and you don't have time to work on all of those. So, I wonder if you have particular strategies you have for doing that.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a good point, because it can't just be, I'm going to work on these using an existing inflexible system, right? Because then I'm just going to drive myself nuts, or I'm not going to have the time. So it has to go in conjunction, right? I'm going to build up the tool set that makes it easier and easier to serve these, and then I could do that piece. It's hard, right? Because those are small problems. I think it's finding examples of that. It's finding advocates in the business that could come back and say the value, whether it's specific value or the value they've articulated because of what you've done. And over time, like, we did justify some of that, getting some dedicated space for open labs and other pieces like that. But I think it has to be a mixture of both trying to measure the value, if you can, of those small things, but then also talking to some of those cultural components. I would say the other thing that we looked at internally, which isn't necessarily an official thing, but there was also really brand and our own existence risk as a center of excellence if we continue to ignore all this stuff, right? If people feel like, hey, those guys are only solving world hunger but never will help us, there's a risk to the reputation and how something's going. So I think that resonated some with internal leadership, and then with external leadership, it resonated, okay, well, these are all problems we want to solve, and so how can we more quickly get to them? And it's a balance. It's like, I can't do everything, right? And even like, when I talk to people about how to think about data in Domo and how much data in Domo and all these places, it's like, I still like to, like, even if before I was answering 10%, like the top 5 or the top 10, right? And even if I could get to 80 or 85, even if there's 15% that are still orphaned or require a little more work, or I do need to hire more resources, that's still such a better starting point. and so much value that I picked up. And sometimes having that humility to acknowledge, like, I get it, like, we can't do everything. We can't just be the drive-by place. We can't, but we can find some ways to balance between that and to do that, so. Yeah, go ahead.
How do you balance the, if you're going to try and extend the ability for individuals in the business departments to begin creating their own content?
Yeah.
We found that when we started our journey, we had every department had their own flavor of, say, their financial reporting. They were getting the data out of Hyperion, and each department had someone with Excel and pivot tables. And so if you're the executives bringing all the VPs into your office and saying, hey, how are we doing this month? Everyone's giving you a different spreadsheet in a different format.
Yeah.
So when we started our journey, we said, okay, no, one centralized set of KPIs. We formed a team of representatives from each department to get them to agree that these things met their needs. But if we take the next level and we say, okay, now each of you can start creating your own content, I'm afraid they're going to go rogue again, and there's going to be 1,000 different flavors of what should be the one.
No, and I would say a couple of things. One is I would say, like, not all data is created equal, right? It's important to go in, like, great. So, like, me saying everyone should have sales is not me saying everyone should have HR data, and it's not me saying everyone should be able to define the company-wide KPIs, right, or the OKRs, or whatever you think of it. So I think acknowledging that, because again, if you're blind to that, if you just say, yay, data curiosity, Ben said give everyone all the data, without the realities of if I'm a healthcare company or whatever it is, you need to acknowledge some of that balance. I think this is a place where some of the theory around agility and curiosity starts bumping up against the how do you build a product that supports that, right? So I think a lot of the stuff that we're working on in Domo around certification, group and departmental administration, Domo stats, having data to be able to track it, I think those are some of the building blocks that let me feel comfortable with some things going out. Some things are certified, some things like HR data is more under PDP and really hard to get to. Some things are, I'm letting this group be the owner of this one page but nothing else, right? So I think some of those pieces and some of the tooling, to me is actually like more foundational. It's funny because you might look at some of those things, those seem very sort of administrative, but I look at those features we've been adding and I say, no, this is all about culture. This is all about the reason we've achieved the kind of usage we've seen at Target and Domo is not like one use case or the top 5, it's a long tail of analytics, right? And so maybe I was just willing to say screw it, I'll let more people be editors, and there was risk to that, and it wasn't for like HR data, it was for other things, but I think if you can create an ecosystem that lets you comfortably and responsibly allow some of that, that's where you have to find that, and have the data to be able to have visibility and say, oh, you know what? This doesn't work, or if someone's looking at something they shouldn't, I need to have that, but you need that ecosystem, otherwise it can sort of go too far both ways. And Chad, who was in here before, who's the major, he left, but who's the major Domo at Target, spends a lot of his day figuring this stuff out, and who has too much access, too little access, do we need to clean things up? That's part of the muscle that you need. But I would say that in either case, it takes a lot of work to fully lock everything down, and then try to still find ways to innovate. And it takes a lot of work, if you're letting people innovate, to maintain alignment. I'd rather put my energy to maintaining alignment within an innovative space, as opposed to trying to find innovation in a very highly locked down space. So it's a choice. All right. There's time for one more, but I know lunch is calling too. One more.
Thanks, great presentation. I identify with a lot of what you say about, users that feel like their problem isn't really good enough, and so I totally agree with so much what you said. But one challenge that I've encountered is the politics of data.
Politics, really?
Yeah. And so like I will build a solution for a persona, a set of users, but management, they're a little too nervous to unleash that when these individuals are just dying out there in their spreadsheets trying to put things together when I've done it.
Yeah.
And so how have you navigated the politics of certain things like that and trying to get people on board?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is persistence and patience, right? Because, and I think one thing I learned is it's also like people are busy. So you can't take it personally, and you have to continue to hammer away at it, right? So even though I feel like, oh wow, we send all these emails and we have all these open office hours and we do all these different things, and it just is sort of like dribs and drabs of change, that's just the reality, right? Because people are busy. And so I think it's being patient with that and trying lots of different things and testing it. And so, we had this idea of an open lab, sort of like the urgent care for data. And I put it as one of my team's OKRs, like one of the last quarters I was there. And we really pushed on like, how do we promote it? How do we, send out emails saying this is what we're working on this week or whatever it is. And that's still just, again, it just sort of quickly inches up, but we have to have multiple channels. So you try that. You have people sit on the floor with the buyers. You have a hip chat or a buzz channel. And I think I used to get really frustrated by that, and some of my team would be like, God, no one's paying attention. They have a day job. They're busy. And so I can't be shy about continuing to hit on those channels and use data to figure out which channels are actually working, right? And then, and so a lot of that data, and we did actually a pilot. So one of the things we started sort of in this urgent care idea was this idea of an ASCII Dobby team, right? So like to handle those small problems. And we did a pilot. We like brought in a couple of different teams that were more in like maybe a prioritization mode. And we said, okay, we're going to start taking on these small problems. And we had feedback. We had data points about how many requests we were able to handle with a small team. And so we sort of started building up this idea and make the case that we could do that. But you have to just continue to try those different things because it's not going to be easy. And it's not because they don't care. Sometimes they might not care. Or they might not have the skill set. But again, that's part of the cultural transformation to move it along. And it comes from both ways, right? If you have one leader who's always looking at the metrics and talking about the metrics and doing it, her team is going to react in a different way than the leader who's not. But you sort of have to hope that over time, those leaders that are data savvy are the ones who eventually are more successful. And over time, you end up with changing your culture, but it's not going to happen overnight, and you're still going to get some of those pieces of resistance. So. All right, the clock says 0. A red light is flashing. Enjoy the rest of Domopalooza. Enjoy Boys to Men. And I'll be around tonight at the concert or one night if you want to talk. Thanks, everyone.